Dr. Evelyn Hart sat hunched over her journal, fingers clutching the pen as if it might ground her to the reality slipping away. Outside, the island's silence pressed against the thin walls, a creeping void that seemed to suck the sound from the air itself. Each breath she drew felt heavier, weighted with the knowledge that the memories of her team, their names, their histories, were dissolving like salt in the tide. She glanced up as a soft knock echoed from the entrance. Dr. Samuel Ortiz stepped in, his pale face shadowed by the dim light. His glasses caught a faint gleam before he removed them, rubbing tired eyes. "Evelyn," he began, voice low but edged with exhaustion, "we need to talk." She nodded, motioning toward a cluttered table strewn with maps and datapads. "What is it, Sam?" Ortiz hesitated, swallowing hard. I'm starting to question everything we thought we knew. The island's influence, it's not just physical. It's psychological, yes, but it defies all rational explanation. I've been trying to hold on to skepticism, to reason it out, but..." He trailed off, gaze flickering to the fogged window where shadows shifted ominously. Evelyn's jaw tightened. "We all feel it. The silence, the forgetting, but science is our anchor. We can't let fear fracture us." Ortiz shook his head. "I'm not sure we have a choice anymore. Last night, I found myself staring blankly at my own reflection. I forgot my age, my family, everything that made me who I am. If this is some supernatural force, it's beyond any psychological framework I've studied." The confession hit Evelyn like a blow. She had suspected the worst, but hearing it confirmed shattered her fragile resolve. "We need to find a way to fight it," she said firmly. "If memories are slipping away, then we must anchor ourselves through language, through ritual. Lena's work might hold the key." Just then, the door creaked open and Marcus Lynn strode in, his leather jacket slightly damp from the mist outside. His eyes were wild, fingers twitching nervously. "Did you hear that?" he demanded, voice sharp. The ground shifted again near the northern ridge. "This place isn't just erasing who sits alive, messing with our heads." Ortiz shot him a look. "Marcus, reckless as always. We don't know what we're dealing with. Charging into the unknown won't help." Marcus bristled but said nothing, his gaze drifting to Evelyn, silently pleading for guidance. The tension in the room thickened, a fragile web of trust stretched thin. Meanwhile, Lena Carr sat in a corner, fingers tracing the edges of a weathered notebook. Her pale face was drawn, strands of light hair falling over her eyes as she whispered words no one else understood. Fragments of a lost language she believed could stave off the erasure. "Naming is resistance," she murmured, voice barely audible. "To name is to remember." Myra Chen and Eli Turner exchanged worried glances nearby, the strain of the island's silence settling over them like a shroud. Nia Brooks, the assistant linguist, shivered in place, her growing fear mirroring the team's unraveling sanity. Outside, Captain Jonas Reed paced the perimeter of camp, his rugged face set in grim lines. Years at sea had taught him to read the signs of danger, and the island whispered warnings in every rustle and shadow. Yet no amount of experience could prepare him for the invisible erosion gnawing at the minds of his crew. As night deepened, the camp fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the scratch of Evelyn's pen and the occasional muffled whisper from Lena's corner. The island's creeping influence was no longer subtle. Memories flickered and vanished. Paranoia blossomed like a toxic flower. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Evelyn confided in Ortiz, "We're losing ourselves. I don't know if any of us will make it out intact." Ortiz nodded slowly, the skeptic's armor cracking. Perhaps the only way to survive is to accept what we cannot understand. But acceptance felt like surrender, and surrender was the last thing Evelyn could bear. The island held them in its silent grip, fracturing minds and unraveling bonds. As the night stretched on, the question lingered how long before the silence consumed them all. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing sound and light. Somewhere in the distance, a faint whisper slipped through the darkness, an echo of forgotten names and lost souls, beckoning the expedition further into the abyss. And beneath it all, the island waited, patient and eternal, to erase what had dared to trespass. Marcus Lynn was already moving ahead, his worn leather jacket brushing wet leaves as he stepped deeper into the forest. His movements were purposeful, almost reckless, a stark contrast to the measured caution Evelyn Hart tried to impose on the team. "Marcus, wait," Evelyn called, her voice taut with urgency, but the geologist did not slow. His eyes gleamed with a dangerous mix of curiosity and defiance, the kind that had fueled his every reckless choice since joining the expedition. The forest around him seemed alive, but not in any natural way. Trees twisted subtly, trunks bending and straightening like slow breathing. Paths that had been clear moments before had vanished, replaced by patches of bramble or shifting moss. Marcus's boots sank slightly into the ground, which felt less solid than it ought to be, as if the soil was breathing beneath his feet. A soft rustle echoed from behind a copse of gnarled trees, and Marcus froze. The air was thick with a creeping silence, but beneath it, faint whispers seemed to ripple through the leaves, whispers that made the hairs on his neck stand upright. Evelyn watched from the edge of the clearing, her pulse quickening. The island's power was intensifying, and Marcus was pushing into its heart without heed. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to breathe steadily as visions from her past flickered unbidden. Her mentor's face, pale and lifeless, lost to an expedition much like this one. The guilt that had driven her here now gnawed at her resolve. "Marcus, come back," she shouted again, voice cracking with a mixture of fear and command. But the forest swallowed the words, and Marcus was gone from sight. The radio crackled to life on her belt, the static thick like a wall. Marcus's voice filtered through, broken and distorted. "Evelyn, something's wrong." The ground, then silence. Evelyn's heart hammered. "Marcus, respond." She grabbed the radio, her fingers trembling, but only static answered. The island was interfering with their technology, severing the tenuous links they had with each other. "We have to find him," she said, her voice low but resolute. "Now." Captain Jonas Reed nodded grimly, rallying the remaining team members. Lena Carr's pale face was drawn tight with worry, her light hair falling over her eyes as she muttered forgotten words under her breath, a ritual she hoped might anchor them against the island's encroaching silence. They moved cautiously into the forest, the terrain twisting in ways that defied logic. A rock that had been solid moments before seemed to ripple like a mirage. A tree bent impossibly, its branches stretching and retracting like limbs of some great, unseen creature. Evelyn's mind raced. The island was not merely a place, but a sentient force, a manifestation of forgotten histories and erased identities. It was reshaping itself, and with it, the very reality the team depended on. As they pressed deeper, Evelyn's thoughts drifted to the mentor she had lost, Dr. Harold Crane. His disappearance had haunted her for years, a shadow she had hoped to outrun here, but the island was forcing her to confront that darkness head-on. She felt the weight of every failure, every loss, as if the island fed on her guilt. Suddenly, a scream shattered the silence, raw and desperate. Evelyn spun toward the sound, heart in her throat. Marcus stumbled into view, eyes wide with terror, clothes torn and mud-streaked. I got turned round, he gasped. The ground it shifted. I thought I was going to fall in forever. Evelyn rushed to his side, gripping his arm. We need to move, now. The island's changing too fast. Marcus's bravado had cracked, replaced by raw fear. But even as they retreated, the forest seemed to close behind them, paths disappearing and reappearing like a living maze. Back at camp, the team gathered, faces pale and drawn. The incident had fractured their fragile sense of safety. Evelyn's leadership now bore the heavy burden of keeping them together against an enemy that was not just external, but existential. That night, as the island settled into a deep, suffocating silence, Evelyn sat alone outside her tent. The weight of the day pressing down. She pulled out her journal, fingers trembling as she wrote, "The island shifts beneath our feet, not merely land, but memory and identity itself. Marcus's recklessness nearly cost him his life. I feel the past closing in, the ghost of Harold watching, reminding me of what's at stake. We are caught between science and oblivion, and I fear which will win." The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a silence so deep it felt like the end of everything. Evelyn's eyes closed, but sleep would not come. The island was watching, waiting, and the tide of erasure was rising. She was determined not to be lost to its depths, not yet. But the struggle was only beginning. As the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, the island breathed around them, alive and indifferent, a shifting terrain of terror that would test every ounce of their resolve. And Marcus sat quietly by the fire, the leather jacket replaced by a damp shirt, his gaze distant. The island had touched him, changed him, and the reckoning was far from over. Evelyn's voice broke the morning stillness. We need to map what we can, name it, anchor ourselves, or we will all be swallowed. The words hung in the air like a fragile promisor, a desperate plea. Outside, the forest pulsed, waiting for their next move. Beneath a canopy of twisted branches, Lena Carr crouched, her fingers trembling as they traced the faint carvings etched into the bark of a gnarled tree. The symbols were jagged, half-forgotten shapes that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim glow of her headlamp. She whispered the strange words beneath her breath, careful not to break the fragile thread of sound that tethered her to reality. "They're fragments," she murmured, voice barely audible even to herself. "Pieces of a language, lost to time." Around her, the camp lay shrouded in creeping fog, the oppressive silence thick enough to choke the night air. Elsewhere, the others moved like shadows, Evelyn pacing near the shore, her dark hair whipping in the salty breeze. Marcus, restless and agitated, his leather jacket soaked from an earlier exploration. Captain Reed, vigilant and unyielding, standing guard where the sea kissed the jagged rocks. Lena's breath hitched as she pieced together the snippets of language, a tapestry woven from forgotten tongues and erased memories. These were not merely words, they were the island's story, whispered in silence, carved into its bones. The island was a vessel, a mausoleum for vanished peoples and lost histories. It was alive, sentient, preserving itself through erasure. Evelyn approached quietly, eyes heavy but sharp. "What have you found?" Lena looked up, pale face framed by strands of light hair. "It's a language of forgetting and preserving. The island remembers by forgetting. It stores the past by erasing it from the world." Marcus joined them, skepticism and fear warring in his gaze. "So it's a trap, a tomb." "More than that," Lena whispered. "It's a guardian. It protects itself by swallowing those who come too close, by unmaking their histories. A sudden chill swept ashore as fog rolled in thicker, swallowing the sound of waves and footsteps alike. From the mist, spectral silhouettes flickered, ghostly shapes that seemed to drift just beyond the veil of perception. Evelyn's heart pounded, her scientific resolve cracking under the pressure of the unknown. "We're not just visitors," she said, voice low. "We're trespassers in something ancient and terrible." Captain Reed's voice cut through the mounting tension. "We need to hold fast. Understand it, or we don't leave at all." Back at the camp, Lena gathered the team, her voice steady despite the dread that clung to her words. She shared the fragments of the lost language, the whispers embedded in the island's soil and stone. The team listened, enraptured and horrified, as the island's nature unfolded before them like a dark bloom. The silence around them deepened, no longer empty but filled with the weight of forgotten names and erased memories. The island was not merely erasing their presence, it was rewriting reality itself. Each word Lena spoke seemed to push back the silence, momentarily anchoring their identities against the tide of oblivion. Yet with knowledge came terror. The island's sentience was no longer a distant mystery, but a palpable force, watching, waiting. The team's fragile grasp on their reality wavered, the boundary between memory and nothingness blurring like the fog outside. In the quiet moments between revelations, Lena whispered the island's lost words again, each syllable a plea for survival. The night stretched on, endless and oppressive, as the island listened and remembered, and the scientists faced the chilling truth that to know the island was to risk being unmade by it. But even as the silence crept closer, a spark of understanding had been kindled. The island's language was a key, fragile and imperfect, but a key nonetheless. And for the first time, the team clung to the hope that naming the unnameable might be their only defense against the erasure consuming them all. Outside, the spectral silhouettes shimmered like forgotten ghosts, and the tide whispered its eternal secret. The island waited, patient and merciless, as the scientists whispered back, desperate to be heard in the silence. The night was far from over, and the island had many more secrets to reveal. But for now, amidst the creeping silence, Lena's words echoed, a fragile defiance against the void, and the island listened. Captain Jonas Reed stood on the deck of the expedition ship, the salt wind biting through his naval coat as his gaze remained fixed on the eerie silhouette of the island. It was an island that no chart dared to mark, a landmass that seemed to exist just beyond the grasp of reason and, now just beyond the reach of memory. Reed's weather-beaten face was set in a hard line, his eyes narrowed against the creeping fog that swallowed sound and light alike. Around him, the murmurs of the crew fluttered like nervous birds, their voices low and uncertain. The ship rocked gently, a lullaby of unease that echoed the growing tension within the team. Inside the cramped lab, the atmosphere was far from calm. Dr. Evelyn Hart's sharp features were drawn tight with frustration as she clutched her well-worn notebook, the edges frayed from constant use. Across from her, Dr. Marcus Lynn leaned forward, his worn leather jacket creaking softly with the motion. His eyes burned with restless energy, a wildfire barely contained beneath his calm exterior. "We can't just sit here and wait for this island to erase us," Marcus snapped, voice low but fierce. "We have to push further, map every inch before it's too late." Evelyn's gaze flickered with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "And risk losing ourselves completely. That's reckless, Marcus. We need to understand what we're dealing with before charging blindly into its maw." Their argument was a sharp contrast to the silence pressing in beyond the lab walls, a silence that was not merely the absence of sound but a presence, a force that gnawed at their minds and memories. Nearby, Lena Carr sat cross-legged on a smooth rock near the shoreline, her pale fingers tracing invisible patterns in the damp sand. Her light hair fell in soft curtains around her face, partially obscuring the flicker of hope and fear in her eyes. She whispered the fragments of a language that seemed as old as the island itself, a fragile thread she clung to against the tide of oblivion. "Namelessness is the enemy," she murmured, voice barely audible over the gentle lapping of unnatural tides. "If we forget the names, we forget what we are." In the dim common room, Dr. Samuel Ortiz paced restlessly, his thin frame casting long shadows in the flickering lantern light. His glasses caught the glow, momentarily revealing the sharp intellect behind his pale, guarded expression. Yet tonight, his usual confidence was fractured, his skepticism wavering beneath the relentless pressure. "All this talk of supernatural forces," Ortiz muttered to himself, voice tight with disbelief and something darker fear. "It's just our minds breaking down. We can't let this island win by surrendering to superstition." But as the night deepened, even Ortiz's doubts felt like fragile defenses against an encroaching void. Captain Reed finally broke the silence, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Enough of this," he said firmly, stepping into the lab where Evelyn and Marcus were still locked in their heated debate. "This island isn't some puzzle to solve with charts and theories. It's a trap. And if we don't start thinking about getting off it, we'll lose more than just our minds." Evelyn's eyes met his, a flicker of respect mingled with frustration. "We're not giving up, Captain. Not yet. There's something here worth understanding." Reed shook his head slowly. "What's worth understanding if it means we vanish from existence? We can't fight silence with words. Sometimes survival means knowing when to let go." The room fell into a tense quiet, broken only by the distant, unnatural rhythm of the island's tide. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing sound and light with an almost sentient hunger. That night, paranoia crept into the corners of their minds like a corrosive mist. The team's cohesion frayed as fear took root. Marcus's reckless pushes into the shifting terrain left him exhausted and haunted. Evelyn's obsessive recordings became both a lifeline and a curse, binding her to a reality slipping through her fingers. Lena's whispered names were a fragile bulwark against oblivion, yet even they began to falter. Captain Reed's pragmatism was a cold beacon in the growing storm, but even he could not escape the island's creeping silence. The clash between survival and scientific obsession was no longer theoretical light, was the battle for their very souls. As the first stars blinked uncertainly through the fog, a question hung heavy in the air. Could reason and caution contend with a force that erased not just bodies, but the very essence of memory and identity? The island waited, its tides rising, swallowing names and histories, beckoning with a silence that promised to consume all. And somewhere deep inside, the survivors knew that the night ahead would bring a reckoning from which none could turn away. Dr. Evelyn Hart sat hunched over her battered journal, the nib of her pen scratching furiously against the paper. Words poured out in a desperate tide, her mind racing to capture every detail before it to slipped away. Around her, the usual chorus of island sounds had all but vanished. The waves no longer crashed with their familiar roar, but instead whispered faintly, as if swallowed by an invisible hand. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence, a living thing that pressed against their minds and souls. Evelyn's eyes darted up, scanning the camp where her team moved with slow, uncertain steps. Marcus Lynn sat alone by the edge of the shore, his gaze fixed on the horizon, hands trembling slightly. She could see the confusion etched across his face, a growing void where his certainty had once been. His leather jacket, usually a shield of confidence, hung loosely on his frame, as if even his body was starting to forget its own shape. Marcus, Evelyn called softly, but the name felt foreign on her tongue, as if the word itself was fading. He turned slowly, eyes glassy and distant. I don't remember why I'm here, he admitted, voice cracking. What are we even doing on this island? The question was a dagger to Evelyn's heart. She forced herself to nod, swallowing the tightening knot in her throat. We're studying the island, trying to understand it, but it's changing us, erasing us. Not far away, Lena Carr crouched beneath the skeletal branches of a dead tree, her pale hands trembling as she whispered words no one else could hear. The language was fractured and broken, syllables slipping away almost as soon as they formed. She clutched a small notebook to her chest, her fingers tracing lines of text she had painstakingly recorded from the island's silent whispers. Each name she spoke seemed to push back the encroaching oblivion, but only briefly. It's like the island doesn't want to be known, Lena murmured, voice barely audible. It wants to be forgotten. Captain Jonas Reed stood apart from the others, his rugged face set in a grim line as he surveyed the grey horizon. The fog rolled in thicker now, swallowing even the sound of the wind. His naval attire was damp, clinging to his weather-beaten frame. Despite his stoic demeanor, Evelyn could see the worry deep in his eyes, man accustomed to commanding the seas, now powerless against a force he could neither fight nor understand. Dr. Samuel Ortiz paced near the equipment tent, his thin frame tense as he adjusted his glasses. His usual cynicism was tempered by growing unease, the cracks in his skepticism widening with each passing hour. He muttered under his breath, challenging the group to hold on to reason, even as his own certainty faltered. The silence deepened, a living veil that crept into every corner of their minds. Conversations grew sparse, words chosen carefully before they slipped away like sand through fingers. The simple act of namming a tree, a rock, a face-bee, came a desperate ritual to anchor themselves. Evelyn's journal was filling faster than ever, a patchwork of observations, fears, and fading memories. Yet, with every page, she felt the pull of the void stronger, as if the island was reading her thoughts and erasing them in real time. Night approached with the slow inevitability of a tide. The campfire's glow flickered weakly, shadows stretching and shrinking like living things. Mira, Chen, and Eli Turner sat close, their whispered discussions about the island's strange ecosystems dissolving into silence. Nia Brooks shivered nearby, clutching a recorder, her eyes wide as she tried to capture sounds that seemed to vanish before they could be stored. Evelyn caught Marcus's eye across the fire, and for a moment, a spark of recognition flickered. He nodded faintly, a silent promise to hold on. But when he looked away, the doubt returned, thick and suffocating. "We have to remember," Evelyn said, voice steady but strained. "Our names, our purpose. If we lose that, we lose everything." A sudden gust swept through the clearing, snuffing out the flames and plunging them into darkness. The silence pressed in, dense and suffocating. Evelyn's breath caught, heart pounding like a trapped bird. In that moment, the island was no longer just a place. It was a forcer creeping tide of oblivion, washing away the very essence of who they were. As she fumbled for a flashlight, the last words she heard were whispered by Lena from the shadows. "Name it, or be forgotten." Evelyn's fingers tightened around her pen. She would name, she would remember. Because if she didn't, there would be nothing left, not for her, not for any of them. The erosion of self was underway, and the island's silence was winning. The next hours bled into a harrowing blur. Evelyn's journal became her lifeline, pages filling with frantic notes, sketches of the shifting landscape, and desperate pleas to remember. Every dawn brought new losses, forgotten memories, lost skills, fragmented sentences. Marcus struggled to recall his geology training. Lena's whispers grew quieter, her hands shaking as she tried to hold on to the language she'd uncovered. Captain Reed barked orders to keep the camp secure, but even his voice faltered, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. "We're unraveling," Dr. Ortiz confessed one morning, rubbing his temples. "This isn't just memory loss, it's identity decay." Evelyn's eyes stung with tears she refused to shed. "We have to fight it. Hold on to who we are, no matter what." But how, when even the simplest words slipped away? When the island's silence seeped into their bones, erasing names, histories, and faces. The creeping terror was no longer a shadow at the edge of their minds. It was a suffocating presence, a darkness swallowing the light of their existence. And Evelyn, the steadfast leader, found herself questioning if survival was possible when the self itself was under siege. As the chapter closes, the team's struggle deepens. The island's silence is no longer passive. It is an active predator, a tidal force eroding the very foundation of memory and identity. Evelyn's obsessive recordings stand as a fragile bulwark against the void. But the question lingers: how long before even these last fragments fade into the all-consuming silence? The island waits, patient and unyielding, as the erosion of self continues.